My name's Charlotte Burton. I'm the marketing manager here at Queen Mary, looking after the Centre for Commercial Law Studies. And today we've got a tester lecture with one of our professors here, Chris Reed, who I'll let introduce himself shortly, who's going to take us through a taster lecture on, well, his own subject, but within the programme of Technology, Media and Telecommunications Law. Always takes me a while to remember that one, but TMT as we know it internally. So he'll take you through that shortly. As we've just been discussing, if you were here a bit earlier, if you want to ask questions, please feel free to. Throughout the session, you can use either the Q&A function or the chat function below. That should be at the bottom of your screen. Or if you want to ask a question, you want to talk verbally to us rather than using the chat function, please feel free to use the raised hand function and we can allow you to talk so that you can unmute your mic and ask a question, which is really nice for us to be able to speak to you as well, so you can engage. Chris and I aren't in the admissions team, so we just ask that you don't ask any admissions related questions because we may not be able to help you. However, I will put the email address of the Student Services support team in the chat for you. So if you have any specific questions related to admissions, then please feel free to ask there. Chris will be able to help answer questions on the topic and potentially some to do with the programme, but any admissions related we won't be able to help, unfortunately, but we can talk to you a bit about kind of what it's like to study with us at CCLS. I think I've covered all the bits and pieces. So Chris, I'll just kind of hand over to you to just do a bit of introduction to yourself. If you want to just briefly talk about what you teach as well, that'll be kind of helpful for people here.
Okay, I will do that, though, just so you guys know, I'm on sabbatical leave next year working on a research project that's related to what I'm talking about today, in fact. So I won't be doing any teaching, but I will be coming in and doing seminars because that makes me do the research and work out what I'm trying to say. So you will get a chance to see me, or of course to avoid me, whichever you seem better. Right, so I'm Chris Reed, I'm Professor of Electronic Commerce Law, and I've been working in the field of technology law since the very late 1970s, I'm sorry to say. So I still remember the time when we could get all the world's technology lawyers together in one moderate-sized room, which did happen in the kind of late 1980s. And since then, we've got a lot of technology, a lot of law. In fact, we're taking over the whole of human life. There really isn't anything that isn't impacted by technology. So that was always my long-term plan, you know, to be in charge of everything. And I'm just about getting there now, I think. Right. What I'm going to do today is to give you a lecture to give you some idea about the kinds of things that we might be looking at in the LLM. And it's worth saying that that you will get different kinds of teaching depending on the topic. So in some areas there'll be quite a lot of focus on telling you a lot of law, so you'll learn the law and they'll learn how it fits together and how to use it. Others will focus more on what the law ought to be, which is kind of important and something that we do a lot of work on. And increasingly, as I've done more and more in this area, I'm less and less interested in telling people what the law is and much more interested in telling them what it ought to be. So this is what you get today. And I thought, rather than giving you something which would repeat something that you might study in the program, I would give you this lecture. Let's just make it display properly. Oh, where is it? My screen's too crowded. Somewhere here. Okay, slideshow. Play from start. That will do it. Right. I want to talk about regulating AI-controlled robotic surgery. And I think this is pretty cool as a topic because, believe it or not, we're just getting to the stage where the engineers are producing surgeons that can, without human control, undertake surgery on the human body. And I know that many of you are sitting there going, I don't like this. This is scary. Yes, of course it's scary. And because it's scary, we're going to want to regulate it. And the question that I want to be looking at now, and I'll talk for half an hour maybe, depending more if there are questions to slow me down, is how I don't have the answer yet, right? I don't know how to regulate robotic surgery, but we're getting there. But I'm going to talk about the research that I've been doing with colleagues to try to work this out. So you see Kerry Greenman there. She's one of my PhD students. She's currently working with robots in the University of Oxford for a couple of years. And we've also been collaborating with a professor of engineering from Edinburgh, who's actually building these AI robotic surgeons. So this is kind of fun stuff. And if you think about it, you can see why it's a good idea, right? Because we don't have enough surgeons, right? There's never enough specialist surgeons to do the really hard work. If we could build robots which were as good as or better than the best surgeons, then we can produce thousands of them and cure lots of people to the standards of the very finest surgeon. So the ambition is great. It's a really wonderful idea if we can make it work. Right. But none of you will be happy about being operated on by a robot unless the robot is safe enough. So that's what we're going to be doing in regulation. We're going to be saying, how do we regulate to make sure that the robot is safe enough? And that gives us some difficult questions, because as soon as you ask us, what does safe mean? We go, not sure. Safe's a complex concept. And then even if we do understand safe, what does enough mean? How much safety do we want from our robot? I mean, we all know that surgery is not completely safe. Yeah, it might go wrong. You might have a reaction to the anesthetic. It might fail to cure the problem. But most of the time, it's safe enough that we're prepared to try it. So we started this project because Kerry and I were at a lecture given by Ram Ramamurthy, the engineering professor from Edinburgh, and he said, this is really cool stuff to work on as an engineer, but I know we can't use it until it's really, really safe. And I think we've got to have something like a 0.001% error rate. Right. And then the lecture went on. And after the lecture, Kerry and I thought about this and said, where does that number come from? Right. He's an engineer. Engineers like numbers. They like standards. They like metrics. Right. Where did he get that number from? So we fixed up a call with him and said, look, what's this number? And he went, I just guessed. Basically, I just guessed at a really small number that might make people happy. And I did a bit of investigation, because one of the things I do for fun is flying gliders, aeroplanes with no engines. And I know something about aviation safety. So I looked up the metrics for aviation safety by the US Federal Aviation Authority. And that 0.001% number comes from that. Right. So that's where he picked it from. It's a number that engineers are happy with. Right. But we thought, hang on a minute, if we've got to be that safe, right, that's very safe, because aircraft weren't that safe when they started out. I mean, the first passenger aircraft were flying in 1918, 1919, just after World War I. And you had about a 1 in 3 chance of arriving. In the other 2 flights, yeah, in some you landed safely in a field, in others you just crashed. Right? It was really, really dangerous. Right? So if we'd applied this kind of error level back in 1919, we wouldn't have any commercial aircraft today. We'd never have got flying, because we got safer as we understood the problem more. So you have to start with a lower number, or you never get a new technology going. So that was the first point. Okay, this number is clearly too small. How can we find him a better number? And then the second problem we have is, as soon as we think about this as lawyers, we go, hang on, safe and enough are open textured concepts. That is, we can't put precise boundaries on them. We can't put in a number that says this is safe enough and then a fraction bigger is not safe enough. That's not how it works. Take a car, for example. You're driving in a car and you go, okay, is the car safe enough? Well, it might be safe enough today because you're driving in conditions the car's built for. Right. Now you take it up into a huge mountain range to an enormous height where the engine isn't working very well, and down a steep incline where the brakes don't work very well. And you go, this car isn't safe enough to be here. So it's safe enough to be there, but it's not safe enough here. Right. So these are not easy concepts to turn into numbers for regulation. All right. So then we thought, well, can we help him with our understanding of law? Because we already regulate surgery, and we regulate it in two ways. Okay? One is every country has a liability law that says, and it's usually based on negligence, unless it's a no-fault system. We have that in Sweden, New Zealand, a few other countries. But even there, the medical profession is regulated based on negligence. They have professional medical regulations that they must be careful. So there's some kind of liability on surgeons based on negligence. And that liability, the negligence liability, requires basically the surgeon should take reasonable care in producing the technology, deciding to use it, and using it. That's a concept you should all understand already because you've all studied some law. And the other thing we do in most countries is regulate medical devices. And I'll be looking here at the EU regulatory system, which also applies still in the UK. And there we do a regulatory assessment before any medical device can be put on the market. And that is a risk-benefit analysis. So you can already tell there are similarities between negligence. What does reasonable care mean? Well, you do a risk-benefit analysis to decide what reasonable care is, and you do the same thing to decide whether we can put a medical device on the market. Now, obviously, AI surgery is only going to be accepted by you and the public more generally if it improves on existing human surgery. So law and regulation doesn't give us the right answer, but it gives us a minimum answer. It says this is the lowest acceptable standard currently that we find in the law and regulation. Right? The lowest standard is being not negligent for the surgeon, and the lowest quality standard for a medical device is not having a risk that's greater than the benefit. Right, that's helpful. So we get this minimum standard, and then we can think about how we build on that in a regulatory system. Now, negligence liability is something you all know about. The wording there is standard UK wording from all our cases: failure to act with the prudence of a reasonable person. What does that mean? It means that if you have an obligation to be careful in law, you have to assess the likely risks of what you're doing and then take reasonable steps to prevent those risks. And if you do that, you're not careless. So if you're driving and you see a small child running about at the side of the road, you should be saying, is there a risk that that child will run into the road? Yes, obviously there is. Reasonable steps to prevent those risks happening. Well, how about slowing down? That would do it. Okay, so that's, yeah, it's easy to understand that. Get the same thing with surgeons. If I just stab the scalpel in at random, might I cut a blood vessel? Yes. Okay, how should I avoid that? Look at where I'm stabbing and be more careful. Right, okay, that's, yeah, it's more complex than that in practice, but that's the kind of reasoning the courts use. And in medicine, we don't compare the surgeon to an ordinary reasonable person because that includes me. And give me a knife and let me stab people, and it's not going to be a happy outcome. So instead, we compare them to a reasonable medical professional who has the same specialism. So we compare surgeons to other surgeons, and we say, how careful must they be? As careful as other similar professionals. And then we recognize there are differences of professional opinion. So, for example, one group of surgeons might say, well, this is the best way to do an operation. And another group might say, no, this other way is better. And they reasonably disagree. We can't tell which one is right. So the law says, okay, so long as you go along with one reasonable body of opinion, that's enough not to be negligent. And then if we're looking at, okay, the Zoom is now hiding the top of my screen from me, but I'm pretty sure it says new medical technologies and negligence. Right. The other thing we need to think about here is the law as it's developed in the UK and most other countries over the years has recognized that when we're looking at medical uses, the only way we get better medicine is by taking risks, because we don't know until we've tried out a new treatment or a new drug on lots and lots of people whether or not it actually produces enough benefits to counteract the risks. So we do trials and so forth with drugs. And then if they don't kill lots of people and injure them, we let them loose in the market. Yeah, it's more difficult with surgery. You know, not many people are happy to go on saying, let's do some trial surgery on me unless I really need it. So it's more difficult. Particularly in surgery, we take risks. Right? And the question the courts therefore ask is, okay, were those risks properly assessed and guarded against? And here we're balancing the risk of this new treatment or this new device against the potential benefit to the patient. And that's been easy with human surgeons up to now, because we just look at the individual patient. But one question we want to ask is, what about the benefit to the health system? For example, suppose that there is a particular kind of surgery that, if you get one of the 10 best surgeons in the world, has a huge success rate. But if you get one of the less skilled surgeons in the world, it has a lower success rate. Okay. What if we produced a robot that was as good as the kind of average professional, but we could treat 10 times as many people? That would be a benefit to the health system and a benefit to the population overall, but on an individual basis, it wouldn't be as good as the best surgeon. And that's a question the courts haven't had to ask yet. So we have to think about that in building our regulatory system. Okay. The other thing to think about with negligence is that negligence has to regulate humans. Right? That's what it does at the moment, and we think it will have to continue to do that. So the humans we're looking at are the humans who develop AI robotic surgeons. That's all the academic and theoretical researchers out there who are working on this at the moment. The humans who decide to deploy them, that's the health professionals who go, yeah, okay, this robot surgeon is now good enough that we can let it loose on people and attempt to cure them. Right? And then the people who actually operate them, the people who maintain them, pay for them, service them, press the buttons to start them. Right? They all have to take reasonable care in what they're doing. Okay. All cool so far, you know, and if we're just talking about a straight ordinary machine, right? Ordinary machines are easy to understand, like cars. Motor cars are very complex, but someone who understands motor cars will tell you, okay, you are driving along the road at a particular speed. If you do the following thing, this will happen. If you turn the wheel, the car will move in that direction. And every time it works. Every time you turn the wheel that way, the car moves that way. It's deterministic. Artificial intelligence isn't like that, because any complex artificial intelligence device hasn't got a simple piece of programming that says, if X, then do Y. It learns how to be a surgeon, in this case, through what's called machine learning. That is, it observes, the technology observes lots and lots of examples of real human surgery, yeah, all marked as successful, failure. Yeah, it was good except for that bit, bad except for that bit. Right? And it gradually learns. It does it by pattern matching. So it's matching the patterns that human surgeons are doing and learning them itself. And the idea is that it becomes as good as or better than the human surgeons in doing what they do. Now, this means we have unpredictable failure modes in any artificial intelligence trained in this way, because we're going to come across situations where the pattern matching doesn't work, and then we don't know what it's going to do. And you might say, well, that's fine. Let's just test it a lot. Okay, we can test it a lot, but we can't test it to infinity. There are always going to be potential ways it might go wrong that we won't have tested for. Right? Until we've operated on every person in the world, right, we can't tell whether it works on every person in the world. And that's not a feasible testing regime. So machine learning is a bit scary because we know there are bits of it where we don't know how it's going to work. On the other hand, if you think about it, humans are equally scary because humans are unpredictable in just the same way. Yeah, humans often do weird stuff that we go, well, no one would have expected they'd do that, but they still do it. Right? So actually humans are equally unpredictable, but in different ways. So let's go back to the minimum standard for negligence and think about how we might apply that to our artificial intelligence controlled robotic surgeon. Well, clearly We want it to be as good as or better than a reasonably competent medical profession in that field. Right. We don't want an incompetent surgeon as our comparison. We want a competent one. Okay. On the other hand, we can't say they must be as good as the best, because that's an impossibly high standard to get started. So I think where we like to start is, okay, take a reasonably competent surgeon with that specialism, and to be as good as or better than that person. That's a minimum standard for negligence. So that will be a good starting point if we knew how to measure surgeons. But currently we don't. That's one of the things that our collaborator is looking at. He's looking at, how do we measure human surgeons? Right? There must be ways of measuring them. But at the moment we don't have it. So without numbers to measure surgeons, we're looking at the judgment of medical professionals, because that's how we decide negligence cases. So what we're going to be doing is saying, we're going to take this robot surgeon, we're going to have it assessed by competent medical professionals, and they'll say, is it as good as or better than a reasonably competent surgeon in that field? If yes, it will have met the minimum standard. But our concern is that all this machine learning means it might act unpredictably in some unpredictable cases. So I think the court might go, you know, we need to compensate for that risk. Let's take the example. It's a brain surgery robot, right? It does brain surgery to remove humours from the human brain. And we can demonstrate that all the time, all the examples we've looked at, it's as good as or better than a reasonably competent brain surgeon removing tumours. That's really encouraging. Is there a possibility that at some point it'll be faced with a brain and a tumour and it doesn't recognise it and goes, the only safe answer is to remove the entire brain? We don't want that. That's an unpredictable outcome. So given we've got that risk, we might say, okay, if we're going to use this robot that might just scoop your entire brain out, but most of the time it's going to cure you, we want it to be better than the minimum, to compensate for the risk that just occasionally it might do something that we don't expect, which is really, really harmful. All right, let's turn away from the humans and let's look at the robot as a machine. Right. Now, we already have regulation for medical devices. Pretty much every country has got some system for saying, yeah, this medical device is safe enough to be allowed to be used, and this one isn't. And they all work on the same system. They all say, okay, we will assess the device in advance. We'll make it pass some tests, and if it passes some tests, it can be used in medicine. In the EU, it's based on the 1993 directive on medical devices. And one of the reasons we think this was worth looking at is because the European Union has just put forward an Artificial Intelligence Act to regulate artificial intelligence. And it's going to have a special regulatory regime for high-risk AI. And you'll never guess where they copied that from. Yep, they copied it from the medical devices regulation. So if we understand the medical devices regulation, we understand a lot about the new AI Act, because that's how lawmakers work, right? They go, okay, we've got to make a law. How are we going to make this law? Let's copy something we already know. And so in the EU AI Act, they've copied the General Data Protection Regulation because they've had that kind of thing a long time. I think that was a mistake, but they chose to do that. And without telling us this, they've actually copied the Medical Devices Regulation as well. Okay, right. Now, the way this regulation works is it applies to any medical device which presents substantial risk to patients, and there is a classification system. If we were studying medical law, we'd now spend a whole lecture looking into the classification system, which is mind-numbingly boring. I'm not going to do that for you. Let me just trust me. All right. There are various classes, and the higher the class it's in, the more stringent the assessment has to be before it can be used. Now, all AI robotic surgeons are going to be either class 2B. Now, class 2B is devices which are surgically invasive. Yeah, robots cut you up. Okay, that counts. Are reusable. Yes, we do like to reuse the robot. They're expensive. or they're externally powered. Yep, they don't run on batteries. We plug them into the mains. Okay, that's fine. So they're definitely class 2B. And then depending on how they're used, they could be class 3 as well. Class 3 are devices which contact the body continuously for more than 60 minutes. Well, depends on the surgery, right? Some surgery is quick, some takes hours, right? Or where they directly contact the central circulatory system or the central nervous system. So here is my robot removing tumors from the body, right? Where is the tumor? If it's in the brain, okay, it's class 3. If it's in your leg, might only be class 2B, depending on where the tumor is. So, you know, context dependent. Luckily, it doesn't matter because the standards for class 2B and class 3 are the same. Phew. So that's enough about the classification system. Let's move on to the standards because that's important. What happens is before this medical device can be used, some expert body, some regulator has to undertake what's called a conformity assessment. And that assessment is trying to decide 3 things. Right? Does the device achieve its intended purpose? It's really no good approving a surgeon which doesn't do surgery. Secondly, is it suitable for that purpose? Like I said, you know, a brain surgeon that removes the entire brain, it's not really doing what we're expecting of it. We want something more elegant than that. And then the third element is safety and effectiveness in medical use, which is the most important thing that we're interested in. And the focus of the assessment is explicitly said to be about risk-benefit balancing. So what the assessment does is looks at how well the producer of the device has identified the risks to patients if it's used. They look at the potential benefits to patients, and then they look at the balance between them. And essentially they're saying, are the risks more than the benefits, and maybe enough more that we ought to allow this device out into hospitals and other places of medical treatment. And the idea is that you have, if you're a producer, to think about this, not just when you're first designing and making the device, but also throughout its working lifetime. So you should be monitoring it and assessing whether there are new risks, and if so, whether improvements produce new benefits, and all those things need to be taken into account in this conformity assessment. And the way it's done is in 2 ways. Either you just audit the design and the quality assurance processes used to produce the device. Now, you can see that for some devices, that would be a perfectly valid way of doing it. I mean, let's suppose we have a medical device which, in the course of surgery, holds the sides of the surgeon's incision open. I think it's called a retractor, but I'm not a doctor. I just watch TV programs about doctors. I think it's a retractor. It pulls the wound open so the surgeon can work. Now, it's pretty obvious what it's doing, right? We make a new one that we say is a better one, right? Do we really need to test the device itself? No, because it's obvious how it's going to work. It's enough if we look at the design process and the quality assurance process to check it. Or the other route is to actually examine and test the device on top of auditing the production, inspection, and testing processes. And I'm sure that's what the regulator is going to want to do for an AI robotic surgeon. You know, it'll be no good going to the regulator and saying, look, here's my robotic surgeon, right? Here is a document explaining its design. Here is a document explaining all the testing, inspection, production stuff, right? Please tick the box and say I can use it. I think a regulator would want to actually look at the robot in action and see it doing some surgery before they would agree it was in conformity. So some testing of the device itself. And then there are some external standards as well, which we have to comply with. And there are a couple of those that I've mentioned on the slide. And they all do the same thing. They focus on the management processes, the processes that are used to work out how the technology is going to work, to train it if it needs training, as AI does, and to test it to see if it actually does what it's supposed to do. And we already saw those are exactly the same questions that the courts ask about negligence liability. So they say, well, were you careful in the design? Were you careful in the training, development? Were you careful in the testing? So actually, these are coming down to the same thing. They look like 2 quite different systems, but they're all focusing on the same aspects of it. They're looking at, did you do the right things? And the last one, the British Standards Institute draft guidance, is quite interesting because it identifies some important medicine-specific issues about AI. So it says, you train an AI. If you train it on bad data, you get a bad AI. So one of the questions is, how do we as regulators check the quality of the data you used? Or how do you check the quality of the data? Right. Then testing, all right. How do you test an AI? Because it has an infinite number of operating modes. Which ones do you decide to test for? Right. That's based on your risk analysis. So how good is your risk analysis? And then monitoring operation. You keep an eye on the AI, you learn about its failures, and do you have a process for building that back into new training to make it work better? So these are quite useful elements in a regulatory system for AI. So where does that get us then, the minimum standards? Well, we have to have production processes and deployment processes for the robot surgeon, which aim at and achieve the three fundamental regulatory and liability obligations. So it's not just medical devices, it's also negligence liability. We ask the same questions. Can we show it's likely to achieve its intended performance? Can we show it's suitable for that purpose? Can we show it's safe and effective enough? And to answer the last question, we're asking a very simple question. Do the potential benefits to patients outweigh the potential risks by enough that we think it's worth allowing this device to be used, or by enough so we can say it wasn't careless to produce it or use it for real surgery? Okay, so back to our original question. Engineers are going, well, this is all fine, but we cannot have a panel of medical experts standing by to look at our surgeon and tell us whether it's safe enough, right? We need some numbers, we need some metrics, right? And the problem is we can find metrics for one bit, but not for the other. So performance up to current standards, we could well find metrics for this, right? But reasonable care when designing, training, testing, monitoring, we don't have any metrics for reasonableness. We don't actually understand what reasonableness means. And in fact, this is what I'm going to spend the whole of next year researching. How do we understand concepts like reasonableness and fairness and justice? And then how can we translate that into things that engineers might understand? Because at the moment, if you ask a lawyer to say, okay, explain reasonable care to me, they will give you 20 examples of behavior that was reasonable and unreasonable and say, okay, from that, now you can work out what's reasonable and what isn't. They'll explain the differences between them. But in the end, they can't come up with a definition of reasonableness that works. Right? I want to dig into it in a bit more depth and see whether I can do better than that by thinking about it hard. So performance metrics. What could we do here? Well, the individual surgeon isn't helpful to us because each surgeon has a different set of patients to operate on. So some surgeon might have a really good reputation as a very skilled surgeon, and they get to see the most difficult cases. So their failure rates might be quite high, even though they're one of the best. Right? A moderate surgeon might only get given the easy cases and have a high success rate. And their success rate isn't just down to their skill, it depends on their patients. Who turns up? Right? That's not predictable. But we could provide a collective measure for this surgery. I don't know what the right answers are, but the medics can tell us. I've given some possibilities there. We could ask them, okay, for this kind of surgery, how many people survive 6 months? How many people survive 10 years? That would give us some overall numbers about the current good performance or the current performance of the particular surgical sector. We could ask about the rates of patients with complications caused by surgery. That might be interesting information. And we might ask about cure rates as well. So I've talked about cancer surgery up to now. Curing a cancer is a thing that I don't think any medic would say they've achieved, but they do have numbers. They say, okay, we have performed the surgery and there has been no recurrence within 12 months. We're going to call that a cure for these purposes. Right? I don't know what the right number is, but the medical profession can help to put a number on that. And then if we can get those numbers, we can test the AI robotic surgeon and we'll be able to demonstrate that it meets or exceeds these standards. So we've passed the first hurdle. Right? We now have something that we can show performs as well as the average surgeon. That's a good start. Right? Of course, we also have to control for the surgical errors which no human would ever make. So no surgeon is ever going to remove the entire brain when doing brain surgery, but an AI might. So we need to control for that in putting these metrics together. But even so, you can see how we might come up with numbers that the engineers could work with usefully in developing their AI robotic surgeons. Reasonable care is harder work, right? Because reasonable care is about balancing risks against precautions. And this is one of those things where in the end, you're a human, you kind of make a judgment. You know, you're out for a walk and you discover that to carry on with the walk, you have to jump down a small cliff, right? The cliff is that high. Fine, okay, I'll jump that. The cliff is the same height as you. Yeah, now you're going, I don't know, what's at the bottom? Is it rocks? Is it soft earth? Right, how do I feel about jumping? And the judgment that you're making is about balancing risks against precautions. You know, maybe there's a bush you could hold onto halfway down. That might help, right? So all these things are context dependent. So we can't put simple numbers on them for engineers. But what might help here is a developing field of technology called XAI. XAI stands for Explainable Artificial Intelligence. And the idea is that with this complex machine learning, we end up with an artificial intelligence where we cannot answer the question, how did it make its decision? So let's put it in surgery terms, right? Here is the AI robotic surgeon. It is faced with the human who has got this operation that needs doing, and it has to decide where to start cutting into the tissue that it's working on. If we say, how did it make that decision? We just have no idea. We can't tell you. Right? It's just doing pattern matching. It says, well, the patterns I've learnt. So if it could talk, we have to anthropomorphize these machines. If it could talk, if it had a human brain attached somehow that could talk to us, it would say, look, I've looked at the patterns of lots and lots of surgeons, and those patterns tell me this is the right place to start. Ooh, that doesn't tell us anything. Right? Of course, actually, if you ask a surgeon, why did you start cutting there? They'll come up with a plausible story, but that may not be why they really did it. We don't know how humans make decisions either. And there's a pretty good chance that the surgeon is going, well, I've seen lots of tumors like this before, and that tells me this is the right place to cut. I can't be more precise than that. So XAI has the same problems. It can't actually explain the reasoning, but what it can do is to tell us what factors contributed to the AI's decision. So yeah, the robot surgeon is looking into the incision. It sees the tumor. It sees the pattern of blood vessels. It sees the size of the tumor, its color, its shape. Right? XAI can tell us, all right, which of these made it decide to cut there? And it can't tell us for certain, but it can give us some probabilities. So we can say, well, it's 90% likely, to be honest, that it was a mixture of the color of the tumor and the way the blood vessels were attached to it. And that's the most likely reason why it cut where it did. Okay. And then experts can look at the results of the AI, of the XAI explanation and say, okay, well, that's interesting. So yeah, how close does that match what humans do? How good does that look to us in terms of an explanation of why it's doing it? That might help us to control for these weird, unpredictable risks that we don't know about. And of course, this kind of interrogation of the artificial intelligence can tell us something about the risks. So if the robot surgeon is mainly working on how loud the background noise in the operation theatre is, that's a big red flag, right? That shouldn't be a relevant consideration for surgery. And we've had a bunch of AIs that have done this. There's one AI that my PhD student discovered. She's Canadian, by the way, so this is important to her. It identifies bears, pictures of bears, and it can tell you whether it's a polar bear or a different kind of bear. And you think, well, that's pretty clever. And then when XAI was used, it was discovered that what it was doing was checking the background. If the background was white, it was a polar bear. And if the background was green, it was another kind of bear. Because guess where polar bears live? In the snow, right? Okay, so it wasn't checking for bears at all, it was checking for snow. Now, we need to know that, and XAI can tell us something about that and help us decide if our AI is safe enough to be allowed out into use. So that is my last slide. How am I doing on time, Charlotte? Yeah, I'm okay, she says. Right. I just wondered how long I've been, but my phone won't turn on, tell me. Oh yeah, okay, 35 minutes.
You're fine.
Yeah, right. So engineers want metrics, right? And we can get them some metrics based on collective human performance. That can tell us about the benefits of AI surgery, but not enough about the risks, right? So there are routine risks, which we might understand, and there are machine goes mad risks, which we can't predict. If we regulate the design, production, testing process, just like the medical devices regulation does at the moment, we can fill these gaps. We can use XAI technology to help us understand how the AI itself is balancing risks against benefits. It can't give us certain answers, but it can help us to understand. And that may be enough for us to make a decision that the AI robot surgeon is safe enough to be let loose on the human body. And of course, the final question in our regulatory system is going to be, is it good enough to be as good as humans? Because we need societal acceptance. And everybody here is going to be going, well, this all sounds fascinating and cool, but I'm not going to let a robot cut me up because it's too scary. On the other hand, if we can demonstrate that this robot is better than the best surgeons, how would you feel then? Well, you might take the risk. Okay. And that's probably how we have to get started. We set the standards higher than they need to be in order to overcome the societal concern about this. And, you know, we know that as we become experienced with technology, we get more socially accepting of it. So, for example, everybody at this lecture has probably been on an aircraft at some point. If you've been on a commercial aircraft, there's a pretty good chance that there was no physical connection between the controls the pilot's operating and the bits of the aircraft that move to control how it goes through the air. They're all controlled by computer software. Right? How do you feel about that? Fine. Right. We've been using software for that for years. It's fine. It works just as well as physical wires and levers. So I'm cool with that. But when it first came in, people were going, no way am I going to fly on an aircraft that's not connected to the controls. That seems too scary. Now it seems just normal. Right? And that's what I think will happen in the end with this AI robotic surgery. Okay, Charlotte, I'm done. I'll stop sharing. Nobody wanted to ask questions as I went, so I stunned them into silence, clearly. There's this.
Oh, we've got one now.
Oh, yeah, right. Shreyansh, right, okay. Right, yeah, okay. Shreyansh's question, in case people haven't seen it in the Q&A chat, is in case of responsibilities, we know how to deal with responsibility of human agents. Right? If we're looking at autonomous artificial intelligence agents, how will we assign liability there? Well, there is a madly mistaken school of thought that says we have to ask the artificial intelligence the same questions we ask humans. And that's just madly wrong because it's not behaving like a human. Right? It's a computing technology. It's doing something different. So the wrong question is to say, was the AI being careful? It has no conception of carefulness. It's not a human. The right answer is to say, let's look at the humans who produced it and used it. Were they careful enough? And because that care includes not just design, but also training and testing and monitoring, if all that has been careful enough, we can say that the thing as a whole has been good enough not to attract liability. Right. Apparently you were going to answer that, Charlotte, it says. Is it? Yeah. And Shreyansh, who's clearly knows a bit about this, is saying, what about the black box theory? Yeah, the black box theory is what I was talking about with machine learning, and saying that if we do machine learning and just produce an AI as a result of machine learning, we have no idea how it works. We think of it like a black box, right? It's like a box with a wire going in and a wire going out, and you put signals in one end and you get answers out the other, and nobody knows what's happening in the box. Right? That's what XAI is about. Explainable AI researchers are finding ways to explain inside, to look inside the black box to find out what it's doing. The difference is that they don't find the kind of explanations that humans give, because humans tell stories, right? If somebody asked you, why did you decide, or why are you thinking of applying to Queen Mary? You would tell a story about what you learned as a law student, what fascinated you, the reputation of Queen Mary, what you want to do in your career, and you make those into a story which explained your behavior. Right? Now, inside the black box of the AI, we don't have stories like that. We have probabilities. We have inputs and probabilities. Right? And a human can turn those back into the kind of stories that humans understand, but we don't get stories out. We get possibilities, probabilities. It's a bit different.
We have a question. Excuse the noise in the background if you can hear it. When I sat here, there was no works going on, and suddenly there is. There must have been a lunch break. We have a question from Camila in the chat. If you could see that one.
Oh right, yeah. You haven't got works going on. You've got someone demolishing the place by the sound of it. Right. Okay. Yeah, Camila. What do I think about alternative regulatory mechanisms like regulatory sandboxes for this kind of new technology? Okay, so for those who don't know, a regulatory sandbox is something that's usually developed in an existing regulatory system. Let's take banking regulation for an example. So every country has a system of banking regulation, and it is immensely complicated. In the UK, it's the Financial Conduct Authority. Their handbook is, well, I know it's over 10,000 pages long because I started to count and then lost the will to live before I got to the end. But it's clearly more than 10,000 pages of regulation, very detailed regulation. Right? And then you come up with something new like cryptocurrencies that banks want to deal with. And we go, well, there's no way we can fit that in the existing regulatory system because it's asking questions we don't know the answers to. So the idea there is the regulator builds what they call a sandbox, a little bit of the regulatory system with much more gentle regulations, lets you try it out, the technology, under this light regulatory regime. And the idea is that if there are no disasters, then other people get regulatory approval to do stuff with these new technologies, and the regulator starts to learn how to regulate them. Okay. Now, I mean, a regulatory sandbox for AI doesn't make sense because there isn't an existing scheme of regulation to cut down on. Right? It's much more like with looking at building a regulatory system from nothing. Right? And the problem we have is that I can't think of any aspect of human life that is unlikely to be affected by AI in the next 10 or 20 years. Not one aspect. I might be wrong, but I don't think there is one. And so, yeah, regulating AI is in fact regulating the whole of human life. Now that's a big regulatory system. No one's ever tried to do that before. No country's ever tried to regulate everything that humans do. And yet regulating AI is potentially trying to do that. So we need to approach it piecemeal. Right? If we jump in and say, let's regulate everything, it will be a disaster. I tell you now, the regulation just won't work. Right? That's my prediction. But if we creep up on it by saying, let's do surgery, let's try surgery. Can we do that? Let's do autonomous vehicles. Right? Let's do recruitment systems. These are the things that we worry about. And then from that, we may learn enough to decide what else we need to regulate and how to do it. Now, I have one from Inamul saying, isn't it challenging to understand black boxes? Oh, yes, it's very challenging. This is why you need, in my example, computer scientists who understand XAI to work with surgeons who understand surgery. And they need to be able to talk to each other, which is a problem because they use different language in different ways. So it's not a simple job to do, but it seems to me worth doing because this AI robotic surgery looks like a pretty useful technology for the world if we can make it work properly.
We've got another one in the Q&A, Chris. They're all in different places from Isha, which isn't a question as such, but
right. Okay. Yeah. Isha said, and it's a general question about law, actually, which is she, I'm guessing Isha, she. Apologies, Isha, if you're not she, and you can shout at me afterwards. Says, I'm currently researching how to translate legal terms to metrics. And was wondering why these terms aren't just defined in the text of the law itself, why they're left open to interpretation. It's because law regulates human behavior, and human behavior isn't simple yes, no stuff. Like, you know, let's take a really simple example. It is now 10 minutes to 1 in the UK. It's about the time that people eat here. It's lunchtime. Right. Am I hungry? Well, a bit. Right. We can't say I'm either hungry or not hungry. Right. I mean, when I've had my lunch, I won't be hungry. Right. I'm getting hungrier as lunch approaches. Right. But it's not simple to say, yes, I'm hungry or no, I'm not. There's a bit in the middle where I'm maybe, maybe not. And all human behavior has got elements like that in it. So, you know, are you kind to people? Well, generally, most of the time, sometimes not so much. Is kind easy to understand? These are important concepts to humans: kindness, fairness, reasonableness, carefulness, and we require them as part of our regulatory system, but we can't define them objectively because they're not objective concepts in the first place. They're a kind of continuum. Right? You can go all the way from being really kind to really nasty without being able to say what point you stopped being kind and started being nasty. It doesn't work like that. And that's why we don't define them in the law. We put them in there and we say, judges will tell us what they mean in the particular case, which is great for judges and lawyers. And that's why you'll all have a living for years. But it's not helpful for machines because we need some numbers.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I was actually, while you were talking, thinking about the whole driverless car concept that is apparently coming down the track, and particularly with this, is it safe enough thought, as everyone obviously has different perceptions, and obviously we put ourselves in danger every time we get on the road anyway, but without having someone managing the tool will be interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, the answer to that question is it depends what you mean by enough. So one of the places I've been to a few times talking about AI is Singapore. If anybody attending here has been to Singapore, you'll know that it's geographically a very small state, right? And its downtown center is physically quite small as well. Yeah. If we turned over the whole of the center of Singapore to just driverless vehicles, and it's the kind of place that might do this, but if we did that, the accident rate would plummet now with the current technologies we have, right? Because we'd have a constrained environment, yeah, just within the city center, marked limits. We change the road signage and other bits and pieces. We change the pedestrian crossings, and we'd make a system where the car was 10 times safer than humans. We could do that. On the other hand, in rural Suffolk where I live, since I've given this lecture, there is a road just outside my window and one car has gone past in the last hour. So yeah, things are different here. I'm as likely to see a wild animal on the road as I am to see another car. And stuff grows, you know, the tree that was there last week, there's been a high wind and bits of it have fallen on the road. Right, this is stuff doesn't happen in cities. So what's safe enough for middle of Singapore wouldn't be safe enough for my road, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. Environment makes a massive difference. So we don't seem to have any more questions. I apologise for the background noise going on here. So I will probably wrap it up there unless anyone has any last minute questions they want to put in. But thank you. Oh, we have one very quickly.
Oh, last minute question.
Here we go. Ishmael's or Inamal's got one.
Because I was about to start. I've decided I've moved across the barrier from not hungry to hungry now. It's my lunchtime. But yeah, okay. Can we presume a scenario of subtle biases being embedded in such devices, which would then affect the decision-making process of the AI? Yes, we can, definitely, because we train them on humans. So it's easier to understand with, let's say, a recruitment system, because these things already exist. You submit your job application, and instead of a human looking at it, an artificial intelligence basically sorts through them and says, these are the ones humans should look at, these are the ones we reject automatically. And it does that by pattern matching, saying, okay, who were the successful candidates that we've employed in the past? So Google did this for its own hires because it was Google, and it went, hey, it's really cool, yeah, we're a tech company, we'll do tech decision making. And guess what? It threw out anybody who didn't look like an existing Google employee. So, you know, no women, no people of color unless they were Asian, and so on and so on. If you look at the Google workforce, it's basically young white nation men. That's pretty definitive, yeah, with the occasional person who doesn't meet those requirements. And because that's what they trained their AI on, that's what they got for the outputs, right? No women, no black people. You're just not like the norm in Google at the moment. So one of the questions for any regulatory system is, are we able to identify possible biases and weed them out in the training and testing program? Because that's where it comes from. The biases come from the training and the testing. If we can eliminate them there, we can have a reasonably unbiased AI. But it's not easy. None of this is easy. It's really cool, clever stuff that computer scientists do.
Lovely, thank you, Chris. Just before we finish, someone's just asked if they can share your email. Oh, someone's already found it on the staff profile. So that's been shared in the chat there. I'll also just put the email in here to the student support and questions. So just to finish up, thank you very much, Chris, for your time today. I appreciate it's over the lunch period. I'm quite hungry as well. So I'm sure we'll be heading off to have some lunch now. So thank you very much for your time. It was really interesting for me actually as well. So thank you, coming from a completely non-law background.
You're very welcome. Thank you all for coming. If you do send me emails, it may be a little time until I answer them. I'm chairing our exam board tomorrow, and that's a long and complex process. So, you know, and I've got a research project to do.
Of course, thank you, Chris. And for everyone else, I will be sending out a recording of this session as well. So if you want to rewatch again for any information, then please feel free to. And 1 minute too, I will say thank you very much for everyone attending. And please keep an eye on your inbox for further events that we'll be hosting leading up to September. But thank you for your time, and I wish you a lovely rest of the day.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye now.